After marrying his mistress, the CEO felt victorious. Everything changed when his assistant called. The champagne was already open before the ceremony ended. Daniel Holt did not wait for toasts. He did not wait for the officiant to finish the last sentence, for the guests to settle, for the music to shift into something softer. He reached for the glass a waiter was still carrying on a tray, and lifted it toward the Accra skyline like a man saluting himself. 300 people watched him do it. Half of them smiled, because they were paid to be there in one way or another. The other half smiled, because they did not yet understand what they were witnessing. This was not a wedding. It was a verdict. Vivian Cole stood beside him in a dress that had taken 11 weeks and 4 fittings to exist. She was 31. She was composed in the way that only women who have waited a long time for something learn to be composed. Not calm, exactly, but still. The way a river is still on the surface when everything underneath is moving fast. She smiled at Daniel. He smiled back. Neither smile was the kind people write poems about. Daniel Holt was 44 years old. He had built Holt Capital from a one-room office in cantonments, with a single phone line, and a chair that wobbled on 3 legs into one of the most talked-about private investment firms in West Africa. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in headlines before his face did. Sharp jaw, sharp suits. The particular kind of confidence that comes not from being loved, but from being consistently obeyed. He moved through rooms the way that people moved around him, everyone shifting slightly, unconsciously, to give him the center. He had been married before. For 15 years he had been married to a woman named Claire Holt. She had gone back to her maiden name, Claire Addo, the week the divorce was finalized, and Daniel had noted this with something he told himself was amusement, but which sat in his chest with slightly more weight than amusement usually did. Claire was not at the wedding. Of course she was not. But her absence was the loudest thing in the room. Daniel felt it every time he looked toward the east end of the terrace, toward the flower arrangements. White orchids, which Claire had always found too cold, too formal, and felt something that was almost like satisfaction. Almost. He had ordered those orchids himself. He had also hired the band, a 7-piece group that played the kind of Afrobeats and high-life fusion that Claire had loved, that she used to ask for at every corporate event she ever organized on his behalf, at every dinner party she ever hosted in the house that was now being repainted in colors she would never have chosen. Daniel had hired the band deliberately, and he was aware that this was a strange thing to do, and he did not examine it further. The night was warm, the kind of warm that sits in your skin and stays there. The city spread out below them, lights and noise, and the low hum of Accra doing what Accra does, which is to move and breathe and not particularly care about any one man's celebration. Daniel looked out at it and felt, for a long and genuine moment, like he had won. He had divorced a woman who had given him 15 years, and 2 children, and more patience than he had probably deserved, and he had married the woman he had been seeing for 2 of those 15 years, and the world had not ended. The board had not walked out. The company had not collapsed. His name was still on the building. The champagne was cold. The band was playing. He had won. His son Owen was 16. He sat at table 7, between 2 of Daniel's cousins who kept trying to include him in conversation, and he looked at his plate like it had personally disappointed him. He had not touched his food since the first course. He wore a suit that fit him perfectly. Daniel had made sure of it, and he wore it like a punishment. Daniel noticed his son's face across the room, the closed-off eyes, the jaw set in a way that was uncomfortably familiar, because it was Daniel's own jaw doing Daniel's own thing. He noted it. He categorized it as adolescent emotion, as something Owen would grow through, as grief performing itself in the dramatic way that teenagers preferred. He made a note to speak to him next week. He did not make the note in writing. He made it in the part of his mind where things go when you intend to address them but have decided they are not urgent. Owen left at 9:15. He said goodbye to Vivian with the careful politeness of someone diffusing something. He said goodbye to his father with a hug that lasted exactly the right number of seconds, not cold enough to be a statement, not warm enough to be anything else. Then he was gone, and the party continued, and Daniel refreshed his glass. Vivian was dancing with her cousin, laughing at something. She was beautiful in the particular way that made other men in the room lose the thread of their conversations when she moved past. Daniel watched her, and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted, which is a feeling that lives very close to happiness, but is not quite the same as it, the way that a painting of a fire is not quite the same as warmth. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. Agnes Boateng, his executive assistant of 19 years. He looked at the time. 9:47 p.m. Agnes did not call after business hours unless something required it. She was not a woman who made unnecessary contact. In 19 years, she had learned the precise and narrow borders of her role, and she stayed inside them with the discipline of someone who had decided long ago that discipline was the only interesting thing left. If she was calling at 9:47 on the night of his wedding, there was a reason. He pressed decline. Vivian caught his eye from the dance floor and raised her eyebrows in a question. Everything okay? He smiled and nodded. Everything was fine. Agnes would leave a message. He would look at it in the morning. Tonight was not a night for work. Tonight was not a night for anything that existed before 10 hours ago. The band played. The city hummed below. The orchids, cold, white, exactly right, stood in their tall vases and gave nothing away. Daniel Holt put his phone back in his pocket, lifted his glass, and looked out at Accra like a man who had finally arrived somewhere. He did not call Agnes back. There would be time for work tomorrow. There would be time for everything. He believed this completely. That was the thing about Daniel Holt. When he decided something was true, he believed it with his whole chest, and the world, for a long time, had done him the disservice of agreeing. That night, he slept better than he had in months. Outside, Accra breathed. The orchids wilted slowly in their vases as the cleaners moved around them. Owen sat in the back of a car and stared out the window and said nothing to the driver. Claire Addo was in her apartment across the city, awake at a reasonable hour, reading something, unbothered, or performing unbothered so consistently that it had become the same thing. And Agnes Boateng sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at the unanswered call on her phone, and she did not call again. She simply waited. She was very good at waiting. She had been doing it, in one form or another, for 19 years. The penthouse came with a view that cost more than most people's annual salary just to look at. 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. When the harmattan rolled in off the north, and the city went hazy and golden, it looked like something out of a painting that hadn't been painted yet. Vivian stood at those windows a lot in the first weeks. Daniel noticed and chose to read it as contentment. What Vivian was actually doing was thinking. She thought the way certain people think, quietly, without announcing it, with the kind of focus that looked from the outside like daydreaming. She was cataloging, taking inventory. Every room she walked through, every name she heard at dinner, every document left open on Daniel's desk, not because she was suspicious, but because she had grown up without safety nets, and the habit of paying close attention to her surroundings had kept her standing when other people fell. She was not naive. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes fully open, which was more than Daniel had done. Within the first month, the penthouse looked different. Not dramatically. Vivian was too intelligent to make changes that would feel like a declaration. She did it softly. A different lamp here, new throw pillows there. The family photos in the hallway were not removed but were quietly redistributed, clustered in one corner rather than spread across the walls, present but no longer defining the space. The kitchen, which Claire had stocked with a particular brand of herbal tea that Daniel had never once used, but which had lived in the cabinet for 15 years out of habit, was gradually restocked with things that Vivian actually used. Daniel watched this happen and felt something he identified as progress. There was a dinner, 6 weeks in. His daughter Nadia came. Nadia was 22. She had her mother's face, which was something that had always made Daniel feel tenderly toward her, and now made him feel something slightly more complicated. She arrived on time, dressed neatly, with a bottle of wine she had clearly chosen carefully, and she handed it to Daniel at the door and said, "Congratulations. I meant to say it sooner." She had not said it sooner. They sat down to dinner. Vivian had cooked. Actually cooked, not ordered, and had transferred to serving dishes, which was a thing Daniel had sometimes suspected Claire of doing but had never confirmed. The food was good. The conversation was the kind of careful, considered conversation that happens when everyone at the table is aware that they are being careful and considered. Nadia asked Vivian about her work. Vivian worked in brand consulting. She had clients, a small team, a reputation that had nothing to do with Daniel. Nadia listened to her answers with genuine attention, which was the most unsettling thing she could have done. It was harder to resent someone you were genuinely listening to. She called Vivian ma'am when she thanked her for the food. She called her father Daniel, not dad, not father, Daniel. She had been calling him Daniel since the day he moved out of the family home. He had thought, hoped, it was a phase of anger that would burn itself out. It had been 11 months. It had not burned out. If anything, it had settled into something more permanent. Not a protest anymore, but simply how things were. The new and unsentimental way that Nadia Holt had quietly reorganized her understanding of who her father was. After dinner, she helped Vivian clear the table, which was a thing Daniel had not expected, and she left at 9 with a smile that reached her eyes and a hug for Vivian that lasted a beat longer than necessary, and she shook Daniel's hand. She shook her father's hand. He walked back into the penthouse and poured himself a drink and stood at the window for a long time. Vivian said nothing. She understood, in the way she understood most things, that this was not a moment for words. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder and then went to the kitchen and let him stand there as long as he needed. He stood there for a very long time. 14 months. That was how long it had been since the first divorce filing, since the lawyers and the asset valuations and the conversations he and Claire had in rooms with other people present, because they had both understood, by that point, that rooms without other people present led somewhere neither of them was ready to go. In those 14 months, Daniel had made decisions. Business decisions, the kind that required steady thinking and thorough review, the kind that Claire had always been the second pair of eyes on, not officially, never in any title or role, but functionally, practically, in the way that a person who lives inside your life and knows your patterns and will ask you the one question you forgot to ask yourself, becomes indispensable without either of you planning it. She would review contracts the night before he signed them. Not as a lawyer, she had a background in economics and had given it up when the children were small and never gone back, which was something else Daniel had not examined very carefully. But as someone who could spot the moment when his confidence was outrunning his caution, which it did, with some regularity, when something excited him. The Mensa Group acquisition had excited him. He had seen it as a golden door, a logistics company whose regional contracts were undervalued, whose leadership was tired and willing to exit, whose infrastructure Daniel could fold into Holt Capital's portfolio and grow within 18 months into something twice its current size. He had done deals like this before. He knew what he was doing. What he had not done, this time, was have anyone question him the night before he signed. Agnes had flagged a specific clause in the acquisition contract. Twice. He had received her notes and moved past them because Agnes was an assistant, excellent and loyal and precise, but not an analyst, and he had his analysts, and his analysts had approved the deal. What Daniel's analysts had approved was the version of the deal he had presented to them, the version that emphasized opportunity, the version that did not dwell on the clause Agnes had flagged. He had not understood this about himself at the time. He understood it now, standing at the window on the 42nd floor, but only in the soft and unexamined way that a man understands something he is not yet ready to say aloud. There were rumblings in the financial press, nothing published yet, nothing concrete, but the kind of murmuring that starts like wind before you see the rain. A source here, a question asked in a briefing there, a call from a journalist that his PR head fielded and noted as routine, but which was not quite routine. Agnes had called again, 2 weeks after the wedding. He took the call that time. She said it was about the Mensa account. She asked about a document trail. Routine, she said. The kind of routine that requires the word routine to be repeated more than once to stay convincing. Her voice on the phone had a quality he had not heard before. He was 44 years old, and he had worked with Agnes Boateng for 19 of those years, and he could not name the quality in her voice. He recognized it only as different, something waiting inside it, a door being held open just slightly. He answered her questions. He told her he would follow up. He said, "Good work, Agnes." which was what he said when he wanted a conversation to end. She said, "Yes, sir," which was what she said when she allowed a conversation to end but had not finished having it. He hung up. Across the city, in an apartment in Le Bon that she had found herself and furnished without asking anyone's opinion, Claire Addo was building something. She had started a consultancy 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Small at first. 3 clients. A website that her nephew had built over a weekend. A corner of her apartment that became an office. She focused on financial strategy for mid-size businesses. She was very good at it. She had not known, until she started doing it independently, how good she was at it, because she had spent 15 years being good at it inside a marriage where the output had someone else's name on it. Daniel heard about the consultancy through a mutual contact at a networking event. He laughed. "Good for her," he said, in the tone of someone who genuinely means it and doesn't notice how much effort that tone requires. The man he said it to smiled politely and changed the subject. Daniel drove home that evening with the radio off. He rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. Vivian was on a call for work. He poured himself a drink. He stood at the window. He looked at Accra and thought about the Mensa clause. He thought about Nadia's handshake. He thought about Owen's 16-year-old face at a wedding reception, eating nothing, leaving early. He thought about Agnes's voice. Then he thought about the view, and the champagne, and the orchids, and the verdict he had delivered to himself 11 months ago. He had won. He refreshed his drink and watched the city until Vivian finished her call and came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and it was, by any observable measure, a good life. It was a very good life. He told himself this 3 times before he believed it. The quarterly review was set for a Tuesday. Daniel arrived at the boardroom 8 minutes early, which was his version of punctuality, early enough to be first, positioned at the head of the table before anyone else sat down, the room already belonging to him before the meeting started. He had done this for years. It was not a strategy. It was simply how he moved through spaces. 6 board members filed in, then his CFO, Lawrence, then the head of legal, a careful man named Philip whose facial expressions were so consistently neutral that Daniel had once accused him, during a particularly tense quarterly review, of practicing in a mirror. Philip was not neutral that morning. He was something that Philip never was, which was difficult to read. He sat down, opened his folder, and did not make eye contact with Daniel before the meeting started, which was a thing Daniel noticed and stored without labeling. The numbers were presented. Revenue was stable. Growth in 2 divisions was above projection. The Mensa Group integration, now in its 8th month, was reported as progressing. That word, progressing. Lawrence used it twice. The second time, one of the board members, a woman named Ruth, the one who had been on the board longest and said the least, and therefore mattered the most, wrote something in her notebook. Daniel watched her write it. "The Mensa integration has encountered some structural complications," Lawrence said, at slide 11 of 19, in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed this sentence many times to make it smaller than it is. Structural complications. Daniel set his pen down. The room shifted. Not physically, no one moved, but in the particular way that rooms shift when something has been said that changes what kind of room this is. "What kind of complications?" Daniel asked. His voice was steady. He was very good at steady. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precisely constructed corporate language Daniel had heard in years, the kind that communicates exactly what happened while never quite saying it plainly. The clause Agnes had flagged, the one in the acquisition contract, it contained provisions related to legacy liabilities, debts specifically, that the Mensa Group had accrued through a subsidiary that was not immediately visible in the top-line documents but was present, clearly, in the due diligence materials that had been reviewed. Technically, the analysts had reviewed the main package. The subsidiary disclosure had been in an appendix, Appendix F specifically, 32 pages. It had been marked as reviewed in the checklist. It had been initialed. Had it been read? Philip cleared his throat. This was the equivalent, from Philip, of standing up and shouting. Daniel looked at Lawrence. Lawrence looked at his hands. Daniel looked at Ruth. Ruth was looking at him directly, calmly, with the patience of a woman who had seen many things in many boardrooms and had learned that the truth came out faster if you simply looked at the person who had it and waited. He had signed the acquisition personally. He had moved it through faster than his usual timeline because he had been, the word the lawyers would later use in the document review, the word he had not known existed in a file about him, emotionally compromised. 14 months of divorce proceedings. The Mensa deal closing 6 weeks before his wedding. The season of his life when he was most certain he was right about everything, and therefore least likely to check. The liabilities were not ruinous. This was the thing Lawrence kept saying. Carefully. The way you say the thing that is supposed to be reassuring so often that it starts to sound less reassuring each time. The liabilities were manageable, with intervention, with some restructuring, with a degree of exposure in the press that was going to require a very good PR strategy and a very large invoice. The meeting ended. Board members left with the particular brisk efficiency of people who have more to discuss, but will do it somewhere Daniel is not present. He sat at the head of the empty table. After a moment, Agnes came in. She did not knock. She walked in with a folder, a specific folder, green, the kind she used for documents she had organized herself rather than through the filing system, and she sat down. Not at the far end, not 2 seats away, she sat at the corner of the table, the seat immediately to Daniel's right, which was the seat that had always been Lawrence's seat, and she set the folder in front of her, and she looked at him. In 19 years, Agnes Boateng had never sat at the boardroom table. She had stood beside it, arranged things on it, refreshed the water glasses and printed the slide decks, and managed the calendar that decided who was allowed to enter this room and when. She had done all of this without ego and without resentment, or if she had resentment she had never once let it show, which was its own kind of power that Daniel was only beginning to understand. She opened the folder. Inside it were copies of the emails she had sent in the weeks before the Mensa signing. 3 emails, clear subject lines, specific clause references. The third one had used the word urgent in a way Agnes never used words like urgent. He had replied to the third email with a 1-line response. Noted, analysts have reviewed. His own words, in his own font, printed and placed in a green folder, and set in front of him in the boardroom where the meeting had just ended. Agnes did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the folder, and then she looked at him, and her expression was not unkind. It was not triumphant. It was the expression of someone who has been hoping to be wrong about something for a long time, and has just confirmed they were right. Claire used to flag these, she said, before you signed. 7 words. Daniel felt them go through him like something cold and structural, like a wall discovering it has a crack, not the crack forming, but the crack announcing itself, because cracks are always there before you see them. They form in the dark and announce themselves in the light, and the announcement is not the damage. The damage was earlier. The damage was already done. He said nothing. He could not say anything, because what Agnes had said in 7 words was the thing he had been refusing to look at for months. Not about the contract, about Claire, about what Claire had actually been inside his life for 15 years, not a wife in the traditional, background sense of the word, not a woman who attended events and raised children and made sure the house ran, though she had been all of those things too. She had been a thinking partner, a second set of eyes that knew when his confidence was running ahead of his judgment, a person who asked the one question that kept him honest on the nights before important decisions. She had never had a title for it. He had never given her one. He had never even named it. What she did, not to himself, and certainly not to her. He had simply signed less mistakes when she was in the room. He had simply been, without quite planning it or understanding it, a better businessman when she was beside him. Not because she was brilliant in some obvious way, not because she had credentials or authority, but because she was the person who looked at his blind spots without agenda, who said, "Wait, read this part again," without needing him to thank her for it, who understood the rhythm of his thinking well enough to know when it was running wrong. He had called that marriage. He had ended that marriage. He had replaced that partnership with a woman he genuinely wanted, and who genuinely did not know to ask him to read Appendix F. Agnes stood. She left the folder where it was. She walked to the door with the particular posture of a woman who has said the necessary thing and is now complete. Her hand was on the door when Daniel said her name. She stopped, did not turn fully, just paused, the way a person pauses when they are willing to hear one more thing. "Why didn't you push harder?" he asked. "On the emails, if you knew." Agnes turned then. She looked at him for a long moment. "I did push, sir," she said. "You outrank me." She closed the door quietly. He sat in the empty boardroom with the green folder and the printed emails, and the sound of a very good woman's very quiet footsteps fading down the hall. Outside, through the glass wall, the office continued doing what offices do. People moved, phones rang, screens lit up, the machinery of a company grinding forward. His name was still on the building, but he sat in that boardroom for a long time before he could make himself stand up. 11:47 at night. The penthouse was quiet in the way that expensive places are quiet. Sealed from the city below, the noise of a craw replaced by a low, processed silence that cost money per square foot. Vivian was in the bedroom. He did not know if she was asleep. He had not gone to check. He was at his desk in the study, and the desk had 7 browser tabs open, and none of them were doing any good. The article had leaked early. Not the full thing, just a paragraph. Someone had sent it to a financial news aggregator at 9 in the evening. An excerpt, unnamed source. Enough to be clear. The Mensa Group acquisition, the liability clause. The exposure, Daniel Holt's name, in print, attached to the word oversight. Oversight. He had been reading that word for 2 hours. He had been turning it over in his head with the focused attention of a man trying to decide how bad a thing actually is. And the answer kept coming back the same. Bad enough. Not fatal, but the kind of bad that leaves a mark. On the company, on the name, on the particular brand of authority that Daniel Holt had spent 20 years building. The kind that makes other CEOs say the right things to your face in a meeting, and different things in a car on the way home. His phone rang. Agnes. It was 11:47 in the evening. Agnes Boating, who did not call after business hours without a reason, was calling for the second time in 11 months after business hours. He picked up. "Sir." Her voice was the same as always. Flat, precise. No wasted warmth and no wasted coldness. Just information, delivered cleanly. "Agnes. I apologize for the hour." She didn't sound apologetic. She sounded like a woman who had decided something and was acting on it. "I thought you should know something before 6 tomorrow morning." "Go ahead." A pause. Not a dramatic pause. Agnes was not theatrical. It was the pause of someone organizing information into the most accurate order. "Claire was contacted 6 weeks ago," she said, "by the journalist who's writing the Mensa piece. He reached out to her because her name appears in records from that period. Board dinners, certain strategic meetings. She was present for discussions that preceded the acquisition." Daniel was very still. He wanted her comment on the deal, on your judgment during that time, on whether she had concerns. The air in the study was the same temperature it had been 60 seconds ago. Nothing had changed. Everything felt different. "She declined to comment," Agnes said. 3 words. Daniel sat with them. She declined to comment. Claire Addo, who had every reason to speak, who had been replaced, publicly, who had watched a man she gave 15 years to stand at a rooftop wedding and toast himself, had been handed, by a journalist, a legitimate and professional opportunity to say something damaging, something truthful, the kind of truthful that would have been reported carefully, attributed to a source close to the company's leadership during the acquisition period, the kind of careful attribution that allows for accountability without accusation. She had said nothing. She had looked at the door and she had closed it. Daniel thought about this. He sat in the sealed quiet of the 42nd floor, and he turned it over the way he had turned over the word oversight. Except this time, the thing he was turning over had no clean edges. It was not a business problem. It was not something he could route to Philip or Lawrence or Agnes. It was the specific and private shape of what Claire Addo had chosen to do with a weapon she had been handed, and the answer she had given was, nothing. Not nothing out of weakness. Claire was not weak. He had watched her leave the family home with a single conversation, with paperwork handled and children considered and a plan already forming, and he had wanted her to be devastated because devastation would have made him feel less like the person who had caused it. She had not been devastated. She had been, from the very first day, already elsewhere in her mind, already on the other side of him. Not nothing out of indifference either. He had not been nothing to her for 15 years. He knew that. Whatever else was complicated, he knew that much. She had said nothing because she had decided, consciously, having been given the choice, that his collapse was not something she wanted to contribute to. This was worse than anything she could have said. He could have survived her anger. He had braced for it, quietly, for almost a year. The specific and abstract awareness that Claire was out there, and that he had done something worth being angry about, and that one day, that anger might find a useful shape. He had prepared for this the way you prepare for weather, quietly, without telling anyone. She had not been angry. She had been decent. And the decency was the thing he did not know how to carry. "Sir," Agnes said. She was still on the line. "I thought you should know before the morning cycle." "Yes," he said. "Thank you. The PR team will need to be briefed at 7. I've drafted a talking points document. I'll send it now." "Yes. Is there anything else you need tonight?" He almost said no. The word was already in his mouth, but something else came out instead, something he had not planned. "How did you know," he said, "about Claire being contacted?" Another pause, longer this time. "She called me," Agnes said. Daniel said nothing. "She called to make sure I knew," Agnes said, "so that you would be prepared. She didn't want you to be surprised in the morning." He sat with that. Claire Addo had called his executive assistant, the woman who organized Daniel Holt's life, and had watched the marriage end from an office on the 14th floor, to make sure that when the storm came, Daniel would have a few hours of warning. She had said nothing to the journalist. She had said something to Agnes. She had aimed her one act of involvement not at hurting him, but at protecting him from surprise. "Agnes," he said. "Sir, go home. Get some sleep. I'll see the document when you send it." "Already sent," she said. "Good night, sir." She hung up. Daniel put the phone face down on the desk. He looked at the 7 open tabs, all of them useless now, all of them processing a version of events that was already behind him. He pushed back from the desk slowly. He walked to the window. Accra at midnight. The city still going, as it always was, as it did not stop being for any one man's moment of reckoning. Lights below. Movement. The low continuous sound of a place that did not need permission to keep living. He stood there. He did not think about the article, or about Philip's face in the boardroom, or about the PR document that Agnes had already sent. He thought about a woman who had his children's eyes, and his mother's patience, and 15 years of his receipts, and had looked at a journalist asking for a quote, and had said, cleanly, nothing. He thought about 19 years of Agnes Boateng, entering rooms quietly, and leaving folders and holding doors open that she was not sure he would walk through. He thought about Appendix F. He thought about what a person loses when they stop asking the question they were always too confident to ask. He stood at the window for a long time. Vivian was behind him, somewhere in the dark of the penthouse. She was real. She was present. He did not doubt that she cared for him, in her own particular way, in the way of a woman who had also made her choices with her eyes open. But she did not know about Appendix F. She did not know the rhythm of his thinking well enough to know when it was running wrong. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That kind of knowing is not something you develop in a year. It is something that grows in the years when you are not paying attention to the fact that it is growing. And then one day, you realize the other person has become load-bearing in your life, in a way that has no title, and no ceremony, and no legal document. He had dismantled that. He had called it freedom. He stood at the window until his legs were tired, and then he sat on the floor in front of the window, which was something he had never done in this apartment, something that would have surprised Vivian if she had seen it. And he sat with his back against the glass, and looked at the ceiling, and let the whole weight of the last 11 months settle on him at once. Not with drama, quietly. Just a man sitting on the floor of his penthouse, in the city he had built something real in, holding the specific and private understanding that he had made a mistake he could not brand his way out of. Months passed, the way months do, not dramatically, Not in one heaving shift, but by accumulating ordinary days until you look up and realize the season has changed, and you have changed inside it without noticing exactly when. The Mensa situation was managed. This is the sanitized word for what actually happened, which was expensive, humbling, public enough to leave a mark, and survivable. Philip handled the legal exposure. Agnes handled the communications. Lawrence handled the board, who were unhappy in the measured way that board members are unhappy when unhappiness costs them money. Not loud, not theatrical, but lasting. The kind that changes the temperature of a room whenever a certain name comes up. Holt Capital did not collapse. Daniel's name was still on the building. But the building was different now. The way a building is different after something structural happens inside it. Still standing, still functional, but everyone who works in it knows, on some level, that it is not the same building it was before. Daniel worked harder that year than he had worked since the early years, the 3 legs on the chair years, the 1 phone line office in cantonments. He came in earlier. He stayed later. He read documents with a thoroughness that his younger analysts found faintly unnerving, because CEOs were not supposed to read appendices. The CEO was supposed to trust the team. Daniel now trusted the team, and also read the appendices. Agnes noticed this and said nothing, which was how Agnes expressed approval. Vivian noticed and said something, which was, "You seem different." He had looked at her across the breakfast table and said, "Yes." She waited for more. He did not offer it. This was one of the ongoing unresolved distances in the marriage. Vivian was a woman who processed aloud, who believed that talking was the mechanism for working things out, and Daniel processed in complete silence, internally, and emerged from the other side of his processing with conclusions already formed. They had found a working arrangement around this difference, the kind of arrangement that functions well enough and satisfies no one completely, which is the honest description of most arrangements. She was not unhappy, exactly. He did not think she was unhappy. He was not unhappy, exactly. They were building something. That was the accurate way to say it. Not inheriting something already built, not maintaining something established, but actually building, with some friction and some effort, from materials that were sometimes mismatched. Owen came to dinner on a Sunday in the 7th month. He was 17 by then and had grown into himself in the way that certain quiet boys grow. Less obviously, more significantly. He had his father's posture now. He sat at the table and talked to Vivian about his school project with a naturalness that surprised Daniel, who had expected the careful politeness of the wedding night to last forever. It had not lasted forever. Vivian had done something. Daniel was not exactly sure what. Some combination of consistency and the absence of performance that had made Owen slightly more comfortable in this space. She did not try to be his mother. He did not need her to be. She was something else, some new category that did not have a name yet, and the absence of a name turned out to be fine. Nadia still called her father Daniel. She probably always would. He had accepted this. It had taken him 6 months to accept it. Then one day he had woken up, and it had simply been true. Nadia called him Daniel, and it was not a wound anymore, just a fact about the shape of what they were now, which was different from what they had been, and still something. Still his daughter with her mother's face looking at him across the table, with a critical affection that he recognized as love. The industry event was in November. A finance and investment conference, the kind that happened every year in a hotel, with the right address and the right attendance list, and the particular atmosphere of people performing success at each other, from a comfortable distance. Daniel was there. He had almost not gone. His PR team had told him it was time to return to visible spaces. That absence from events invited interpretation. He had agreed and gone, and he had worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who has been working rooms since his first suit was borrowed. Claire was there. He saw her from across the atrium before she saw him, which gave him approximately 4 seconds to decide what his face was going to do. She was in a dark green dress, and she was talking to someone Daniel recognized vaguely as a manufacturing executive from the East, and she was laughing at something. It was a real laugh, the slightly ungraceful kind, the kind that doesn't know it's being watched. Her hair was different. Her posture was different in the way that posture is different when a person has stopped carrying weight they used to carry. She looked like herself, a version of herself he had not seen in a long time, the version that existed before the wait. She turned and saw him. 1 beat. 2. Then she smiled. Not a careful smile. Not a performed smile. Not the smile of a woman who has rehearsed this moment or decided what it would look like. Just her face, doing what it did when something was fine, which was apparently what this was. She excused herself from the manufacturing executive and walked toward him. He could feel his own heartbeat in a way that was mildly absurd. "Daniel," she said. She shook his hand. Her handshake was the same as it had always been. Firm, brief. A handshake that meant she had taken a meeting with him, and not that she had shared a bed with him for 15 years. "Claire," he said, "you look well." "I am well," she said, simply, as if the word and the fact were the same size. "How are you?" "I saw the Mensa coverage." Something tightened in him. "It was a complicated quarter," he said. "Most important ones are," she said. No irony in it, no softness either. Just the plain and accurate observation of someone who had been in enough complicated quarters to know what they look like. "Your consultancy," he said. "I heard it's grown." 14 clients now, she said. "We're bringing in a second analyst next month." "That's good." He meant it. Fully. Without effort. He said it, and it was simply true, which surprised him slightly. She asked about Owen. He told her Owen was doing well, that he had come to dinner, that he seemed to be finding his way. She listened with the specific attention of a mother listening to news about a son from a source she has decided to extend some trust to, and she nodded, and he could see her adjusting something inside herself, quietly deciding that this information was acceptable. She asked about Holt Capital, not about the Mensa deal specifically, not about anything that would require him to be vulnerable, just about the firm in the general and moving forward sense. He told her honestly. She listened and asked one question, a good question, the kind that went to the thing underneath the surface thing, and he answered it. For about 4 minutes, they talked like two people who know each other well, and are no longer enemies, and are not yet sure what they are instead. Then someone touched Claire's arm from behind, her assistant, or a colleague, someone who needed her for something on the other side of the room. She said, "Give me a moment," and turned back to Daniel. "It was good to see you," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not readable from the outside, but which Daniel felt, in the strange way you feel things you have no right to feel anymore, as something that had not fully become nothing. Then she turned and walked back into the room. He watched her go. He watched her reach the colleague and begin speaking with the focused attention of a woman in the middle of building something. She gestured at something on a phone screen. She laughed again, the real laugh, the slightly ungraceful one. She did not look back. He stood there in the atrium of the hotel with a drink in his hand, and the ambient sound of 300 professionals performing success at each other, and he understood something. He had thought, for a long time, that what he had wanted from the divorce was freedom. He had called it that, in his own mind, in the language he used to justify the years that had led to Vivian. He had called it freedom, the freedom to be who he actually was, with someone who wanted the version of him that existed now, rather than the version that had been built across 15 careful years. He had gotten that. And standing in the hotel atrium watching Claire Addo work a room that she had earned her place in, watching her be fine in a way that required nothing from him, he understood that what he had given up in the name of freedom was not the marriage. It was the witness. The person who had been present for the building of everything, who had watched the wobbling chair and the one phone line, and the early mornings, and the bad decisions, and the good ones, and the signing of the right contracts, and the narrowly avoided disasters, and the version of himself that existed before success, had made him difficult to correct. The person who had been inside his life so completely that her presence had become invisible. The way the load-bearing walls of a house are invisible until you remove one and the ceiling comes down. He had not thought of her as load-bearing. He had thought of her as furniture. He refreshed his drink. He straightened his jacket. He went back into the room, and he talked to the people he needed to talk to, and he was charming, and informed, and steady, in the way that had always been his gift, and no one in that room could have told, from looking at him, what had just shifted. Months later, He sat across from Agnes at a year-end review. Just the two of them. He had started doing this. Quarterly, then monthly, then just whenever. Not a scheduled meeting, just a conversation. He would bring the coffee himself, which was something that had initially confused Agnes so thoroughly that she had stood up when he came in with the cups, instinctively, as if she needed to take them from him. He had told her to sit down. She had sat down. He had put the coffee in front of her. In the meetings they had now, Agnes said things she had not said in 19 years. Not because she had been afraid to say them before, but because no one had asked. He asked now. He asked about what she saw from where she sat, which was the chair that processed everything before it reached him. He asked about the things that concerned her. She told him, in the same flat and accurate voice she had always used, but fuller now, more complete, like a document that had previously been summarized and was now being read properly. She was, he had come to understand, extraordinary. She had been extraordinary for 19 years. He had said, "Good work, Agnes," and moved past her to the next thing. For 19 years. She still called him sir. He had asked her once why, after everything. She had looked at him with the expression of someone who finds a question both understandable and slightly beside the point. "Because that's what I call you," she said. He had thought about this for a while and decided it was its own kind of answer. He was not a man who had a clean redemption. He did not earn one, and the story did not offer one, and he had stopped looking for the version of events in which he was ultimately right about everything. He had been wrong about some significant things. He had cost people, his children, in ways that were still working themselves out, and Claire, in ways he would probably never fully account for, and Agnes, in the smaller and more daily way of a person whose worth is consistently underestimated by the person closest to her. He had won the thing he had decided to win. He sat with what winning had cost. He was not miserable. His life had texture and purpose, and Vivian, who was real and sharp and building something of her own beside him. The company was recovering. Owen came to dinner more often. Nadia called him Daniel, but she called him, which was the thing that mattered. Agnes sent the morning briefing at 7:15 every day. Same as always. He read it now the way it was meant to be read. Fully, starting from the first line, including the things she flagged, including the appendices. He had not stopped being the kind of man who made mistakes. He had simply become the kind of man who read further into the document before he decided he already knew what it said. It was not everything. It was what he had. And somewhere across the city, in the LeBone apartment with the weekend morning light coming through windows she had chosen herself, Claire Addo was at her desk with her coffee, and her 14 clients, and her second analyst, starting next month, building the thing that had her own name on it, in a life that fit her, in a way that no one had given her but that she had, piece by careful piece, constructed for herself. She was not waiting for anything. That was the part Daniel understood last, and understood best. She had not needed him to fall to rise. She had simply needed him to stop being the ceiling. He had given her that much at least, without meaning to. It was the most useful thing he had ever done for her. And she would never tell him so, and he would never ask. And the city outside both their windows would keep moving the way it always had, without ceremony, without verdict, without caring very much who had won.